There is a specific moment that happens at a family dinner that almost everyone in their 30s has lived at least once. You mention something about your finances. Maybe you say you are still renting. Maybe you mention that you put some money in the stock market. Maybe you say you switched jobs again. And before you finish the sentence, a parent leans forward with the confident, unhesitating energy of someone who has figured this out and says something like, "You need to buy a house as soon as possible," or "You should find a good company and stay there," or "The stock market is just gambling with extra steps," and the advice lands with the full weight of lived experience behind it. This is not a person guessing. This is a person who followed these exact rules and ended up with a paid-off house and a pension and a retirement that more or less worked. The advice is not theoretical. It is personal proof, and yet something about it feels slightly off. Not wrong exactly, just slightly misaligned with the world you are actually living in. Like directions that were accurate once but haven't been updated since the highway changed. Here is what nobody says at that dinner table. The advice is not wrong. The world it was built for no longer exists, and the gap between those two things is quietly costing this generation an amount of money that previous generations never had to lose. My name is Nick, and I want to be precise about something before we go any further. This is not a video about blaming parents. The people who gave you this advice were not careless or ignorant. They were passing on what genuinely worked for them in the economic conditions they actually lived through. The problem is not the advice. The problem is the conditions changed and nobody sent out an update. If you have ever felt like you did everything right and somehow still ended up further behind than your parents were at your age, subscribe and hit the like button, because today we are mapping out exactly what changed, which specific pieces of inherited financial wisdom no longer apply, and what to actually do instead. Quick thing first, not a financial advisor, not financial advice. These are structural economic observations and the updated frameworks that follow from them. Let's start with the numbers, because the numbers are the whole story. In 1980, the median home price in the United States was about $47,000. Median household income was roughly $17,700. A house cost about 2.6 times the annual household income. Today, the median home price is approximately $420,000. Median household income is about $84,000. A house now costs roughly 5 times the annual household income. The price-to-income ratio has nearly doubled in one generation. In 1980, a 30-year fixed mortgage rate was around 13%. That sounds brutal until you realize that inflation was also running at around 12%, meaning the real cost of borrowing was nearly zero. You were paying back the loan in dollars that were worth less every year at almost exactly the rate you were being charged to borrow. Today, mortgage rates sit around 7% and inflation is running closer to 3%. The real cost of borrowing is genuinely positive and substantially higher than your parents ever experienced. In 1980, roughly 38% of private sector workers had a defined benefit pension, meaning their employer promised them a specific monthly income in retirement regardless of market conditions. Today, that number is under 4%. The retirement risk that corporations use to absorb has been transferred almost entirely to individual workers. Over the course of one generation, your parents retired with a check. You retire with whatever you manage to save and invest on your own. And in 1980, the savings account at the bank paid somewhere between 5% and 8% interest annually. Leaving money in the bank was not just safe, it was a legitimate wealth-building strategy. Today, the national average savings account rate is about 0.45%. Leaving money in the bank is now a slow guaranteed loss against inflation. 4 structural shifts, 40 years. Same advice passed down, confidently across all of them. Now let's go through each piece of that advice individually. Outdated belief number 1. Buy a house as soon as you can. Renting is throwing money away. In your parents' era, this was not just reasonable, it was mathematically correct. Houses were 2.6 times income. Mortgage rates were high, but so was inflation, making the real borrowing cost minimal. You could buy a starter home on a single income in your mid-20s, build equity steadily, and by your 40s, own a paid-off asset worth several times what you paid for it. The math worked. Renting genuinely was the worst financial decision in that environment because buying was accessible and the asset appreciated reliably. Today, the math is different. A median-priced home at $420,000 requires a 20% down payment of $84,000 just to avoid private mortgage insurance. That is the entire annual income of the median household, saved in full before you buy anything. For the median household earning $84,000 and saving 10% of income, accumulating an $84,000 down payment takes about 10 years of perfect savings discipline with zero financial setbacks. 10 years. Before the purchase even begins, and after the purchase, the monthly math is brutal. A $420,000 home with 20% down at a 7% mortgage rate produces a monthly payment of about $2,237, principal and interest only. Add property taxes, insurance, and maintenance, and the realistic monthly cost of ownership is closer to $3,000 to $3,500, depending on location. On a take-home income of roughly $5,600 a month for the median household, that is 54% to 63% of take-home pay going to housing. The traditional guideline is 28%. The math that made your parents' advice correct has been replaced by a completely different set of numbers. Renting and investing, the difference is now, for many households, in many markets, the mathematically superior choice. Not because homeownership is bad, because the price-to-income ratio has moved so far from where it was when the advice was formed that the advice no longer produces the outcome it was designed to produce. Outdated belief number 2. Find a good company and stay there. Loyalty is rewarded. In your parents' era, this was also correct. The post-war corporate model was built on an implicit contract. You give us your career. We give you steady raises, job security, a pension, and healthcare in retirement. Staying at one company for 30 years was not just stable, it was the optimal financial strategy. The raises came automatically. The pension accumulated. The loyalty was genuinely rewarded with real financial benefits. That contract no longer exists. It was dissolved quietly over the course of the 1980s and 1990s, and the dissolution was so gradual that the cultural advice never caught up with it. Here is what the data actually shows about job tenure and income growth in 2026. According to multiple compensation studies, the average raise for staying at your current employer is between 3% and 5% annually, roughly in line with inflation. The average salary increase for changing jobs is between 10% and 20%. Every time you change jobs, you are essentially getting 3 to 5 years of raises in a single move. The financial math of loyalty has inverted. Staying is now the lower return strategy in most industries. The Bureau of Labor Statistics median job tenure in the United States is currently 3.9 years, not because this generation is disloyal or flaky, because the data on income growth has made strategic job movement the rational response to a compensation system that no longer rewards tenure the way it once did. The updated advice is not job hop recklessly. It is understand that your income growth is largely in your own hands now in a way it was not for your parents' generation. The company is not managing your career. You are. Outdated belief number 3. Save your money in the bank. Keep it safe. We already looked at the numbers on this one. Savings accounts paid 5% to 8% in 1980. Today they pay 0.45% on average. But the more important shift is what happened to inflation over the same period. Inflation has averaged about 3.5% annually over the past 20 years. A savings account paying 0.45% against 3.5%, inflation is not a safe place for your money. It is a slow, guaranteed loss of purchasing power at roughly 3% per year. Your parents kept money in the bank, and the bank kept up with inflation because the interest rates required it. You keep money in the bank, and the bank pays you almost nothing while inflation quietly erodes what you have. The behavior is identical. The outcome is completely different. The account looks stable. The purchasing power is shrinking. The updated version of this advice is not don't keep any money in the bank. It is understand what the bank is actually for. The bank is for your emergency fund, 3 to 6 months of expenses, kept liquid and accessible. Everything beyond that baseline has a better home. High-yield savings accounts currently paying 4% to 5% for the cash component. Low-cost index funds for anything with a time horizon of 5 years or more. The money is not less safe in those places. It is more safe against the actual risk. Your parents never had to worry about the risk of leaving money somewhere that pays you less than inflation takes. Outdated belief number 4. Stay away from the stock market. It is too risky. It is basically gambling. I want to say something carefully here, because this is the piece of advice that has cost this generation the most, and it came from the most genuinely well-meaning place of all. Your parents' generation had a real, lived reason to distrust the stock market. They grew up hearing about 1929. They lived through 1987. Some of them got hurt in the dot-com crash of 2000. The market did terrible things to real people at specific moments in history, and the emotional memory of those moments passed down through families as a warning. Don't play with what you cannot afford to lose. The problem is that the warning was about volatility, the short-term terrifying drops that feel like the world is ending, and the warning was applied to long-term investing, a completely different activity with a completely different risk profile. Here is the actual data on the risk your parents warned you about. The S&P 500 has had positive returns over every single rolling 20-year period in recorded history. Every one, including the ones that contained the Great Depression, World War II, the 1970s, stagflation, the dot-com crash, the 2008 financial crisis, and the COVID collapse. 0 exceptions across a century of data. Someone who invested $10,000 in a low-cost S&P 500 index fund in 2004 and did nothing, did not check it during 2008, did not sell during COVID, just left it alone, would have approximately $72,000 today. The same $10,000 left in a savings account over the same period would be worth about $11,200. The bank felt safe. The index fund felt risky. The actual outcomes were not close. The risk your parents warned you about is real over short time horizons. Over long time horizons, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, the risk profile inverts. The stock market becomes the lower risk option for long-term wealth building, and the savings account becomes the guaranteed slow loss. The advice to avoid the stock market was formed in an era without low-cost index funds, without easy retail access to diversified market exposure, and with a genuine lack of historical data on long-term returns. All 3 of those things have changed. The advice hasn't. Now let me make the full picture concrete with 2 people. Meet Robert and his daughter Claire. Robert is 35 in 1985. Claire is 35 in 2026. Adjusted for inflation, both earn the equivalent of about $84,000 in today's dollars. Robert follows the advice of his era. He buys a house. Costs him 2.6 times his income, manageable on one salary. He stays at his company for 30 years, gets steady raises and a pension. He keeps his savings in the bank, earns 6% interest. He avoids the stock market, too risky. By 65, Robert has a paid-off house worth several times what he paid, a pension paying him a reliable monthly income, and a bank account that kept pace with inflation for 30 years. The advice worked. Robert is comfortable. Claire follows the same advice in 2026. She tries to buy a house, needs $84,000 saved for the down payment first, takes 10 years of perfect savings to accumulate. She stays at her company, gets 3% raises annually, while her colleagues who change jobs get 15% jumps. She keeps her savings in the bank, earns 0.45%, while inflation runs at 3.5%. She avoids the stock market, watches the S&P 500 return 10% annually for a decade while her bank account shrinks in real terms. By 65, Claire has followed every piece of her father's advice with the same discipline and dedication he did. And she is not okay, not because she did anything wrong, because the conditions the advice was built for no longer exist. Same advice, same discipline, completely different world, completely different outcome. So here is the updated manual. 4 pieces of advice, rebuilt, for the conditions that actually exist in 2026. Updated advice number 1. Don't buy a house until the math works for your specific situation, not because your parents did it at 26. Run the buy versus rent calculation for your actual market, your actual income, and your actual down payment timeline. In some markets, buying still makes sense relatively quickly. In others, renting and investing, the difference is the superior financial move for a decade or more. The answer is not cultural, it is mathematical. Run the math. Updated advice number 2. Manage your own career like an asset. Understand what your skills are worth in the current market. Have that conversation with outside employers every 2 to 3 years, whether you are looking to move or not. Know your number, negotiate it. Your income trajectory is largely in your hands in a way it was not for your parents, and treating it as something that happens to you rather than something you manage is the updated version of the loyalty trap. Updated advice number 3. Use the bank for what it is. Good for 3 to 6 months of expenses in a high-yield savings account earning real interest. Everything beyond that baseline deployed somewhere with a return that at minimum keeps pace with inflation. The bank is a parking lot for short-term money. It is not a wealth-building vehicle. Updated advice number 4. Get in the market early and stay there. Not individual stocks, not timing the market. A low-cost, broadly diversified index fund held for decades. The risk your parents warned you about is real over short horizons. Over the horizon that actually matters for retirement, it is the safest long-term wealth-building vehicle in the historical record. Let me take you back to that family dinner. The parent leaning forward with confident advice, the lived experience behind every word, the genuine love in the intention. None of that changes. The advice came from the right place. It was built on real experience. It worked in the world it was designed for. What changes is what you do after you leave the table. You take the intention, be financially secure, build something that lasts, don't take unnecessary risks, and you apply it to the conditions that actually exist, not 1985, not the world your parents navigated with that specific set of tools. The world you are actually living in right now, with tools that actually work in it. The gap between those 2 sets of tools is not a failure of your parents. It is a failure of the update, and now you have it. If this gave you a clearer picture of why the standard advice keeps falling short, subscribe. Because next we are breaking down the specific tax trap that quietly activates the moment your income starts to grow, the one that makes sure that raise never quite feels like enough. I will see you in that one.